In the heat of a stifling southern summer in the 1950s, where every street corner whispered secrets of segregation and a deep, unyielding prejudice, two souls found each other in a forbidden embrace that defied the rigid societal boundaries of their time. Jonathan, a robust, overweight African-American man with kind eyes that belied the hardships of a life marred by injustice, and Evelyn, a white woman whose gentle beauty and fierce independence masked the pain of a world that demanded conformity. Together they carved out moments of tenderness amid a landscape filled with danger, fear, and an insatiable longing that made every stolen glance and secret meeting a rebellion in itself. Beneath the shadow of towering cotton mills, and beneath the unforgiving gaze of an era steeped in racism, they began a clandestine love affair that would see them defy every norm. Their passion igniting in hidden rooms of rundown motels and secret corners of public libraries, their love blossoming. Despite the constant threat of exposure, their hearts pounding with both hope and terror as they risked everything to be together. Their union, both beautiful and tragic, bore the fruit of their forbidden love when Evelyn became pregnant, a miracle and a curse intertwined, as the birth of their child, a symbol of hope and a target of scorn, forced them to navigate a labyrinth of fierce emotions and societal judgment, bringing joy amid bitter quarrels and the inevitable strain that secrets always place on the soul. Even as Jonathan and Evelyn clung to the love that had united them, the pressure of their hidden lives led to moments of betrayal and infidelity. Evelyn, desperate for the semblance of a normal life, found solace in the arms of another man who promised stability in a world that refused to accept her, while Jonathan wrestled with his own demons, the weight of his past, and the fear of losing everything pushing him to the edge of despair, their passionate love marred by heated arguments that echoed in the quiet desperation of midnight and the bitter chill of early mornings. Each confrontation, each tearful goodbye, was a cinematic moment charged with raw emotion as they both tried to reconcile the ideal of their love with the harsh reality of a segregated America where every smile could be a prelude to violence and every secret rendezvous a death sentence. Yet, amidst the chaos, the birth of their child brought a fleeting sense of hope and unity, a delicate reminder that life could flourish even in the most hostile of environments, as tiny fingers and innocent eyes spoke of a future free from the chains of hatred, even if that future was only a dream. And then, in a moment that shattered the fragile illusion of control, Jonathan, already burdened with guilt and sorrow, revealed a secret on the brink of his death that turned their turbulent world upside down, a truth about his own past, hidden from even Evelyn, that explained his unyielding strength and the scars he bore, a revelation that forced Evelyn to confront the reality of their love and her own complicity in the cycles of betrayal and longing, leaving her to question everything she had ever believed about sacrifice and loyalty. As the days bled into nights, and the city around them simmered with the unrest of a divided nation, their lives continued in a state of desperate passion and uncertain futures. Each heartbeat a defiant act of love against an oppressive regime that would never allow them peace, each moment a collision of hope and despair, each secret rendezvous a promise of both deliverance and doom. And as Evelyn cradled their child close to her chest, staring into the void where Jonathan's eyes once shone with steadfast determination, she knew that their story was far from over, that the weight of their shared past, and the promise of a future unburdened by the sins of yesterday would drive her to keep fighting, even as the specter of betrayal and loss loomed over every step she took, leaving her to wonder if the ultimate cost of their forbidden love was worth the price, if every stolen moment of joy was destined to be tainted by the harsh truths of a world that would never let them be free. The night air was thick with the scent of magnolias and burning tobacco, the distant hum of a radio drifting from a nearby bar where laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses, but Evelyn felt none of it as she clutched her sleeping child to her chest, rocking back and forth in a wooden chair that groaned beneath her weight, her heart a battlefield of grief, guilt, and unrelenting love for the man who was no longer beside her. Jonathan had been everything, her defiance against the world, her shelter in the storm, her greatest weakness and her deepest strength. But now the house felt hollow, the walls still stained with the echoes of his voice, the floorboards still heavy with the steps he once took, and she could still feel the warmth of his hands on her skin even though the cold reality of his absence pressed against her like an iron fist around her throat. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tear at the sheets on their bed until her fingers bled, but she had no room for sorrow. Because sorrow required safety, and safety was a luxury she had never known, not in the years they spent hiding, not in the moments when she watched him glance over his shoulder before kissing her, not when she lay awake at night, wondering if a knock at the door would be the last sound she'd ever hear. She thought about the night Jonathan told her his secret, the weight of his confession pressing against them both like the suffocating southern heat. He had lied to her, not out of malice, not out of selfishness, but out of a desperate need to shield her from a past that could have unraveled everything before it even began, a past that explained the bruises she never questioned, the men who looked at him with something more than hatred, something closer to recognition, closer to vengeance. He had killed a man once, not in cold blood, but in the kind of brutal self-defense that a black man in America could never claim without consequence, a fight for survival that ended with him fleeing a town that would have hanged him without trial, a truth that, had it been discovered, would have meant certain death for him, for her, for their child, a truth that made her love him even more and hate him all the same because he had carried it alone, had suffered in silence while she thought she had been the only one drowning in secrets. Now he was gone, taken from her by the same cruel world that had tried to tear them apart for years. And she was left with nothing but a half-written story and a child who would one day ask questions she didn't know how to answer. The town whispered about her now, eyes lingering too long whenever she walked to the store, voices lowering when she passed by as if they weren't talking about her, as if she couldn't feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her spine. Some of them pitied her, some of them despised her, but none of them would ever understand the war she had fought just to love a man they had deemed unworthy, just to bring a child into a world that didn't want her. And then there was Henry, the man who had once promised her a life without fear, the man she had turned to in a moment of weakness when Jonathan had been too angry, too distant, too lost in the burden of his own pain to see that she had been breaking too, the man who now knocked at her door in the dead of night, offering safety at a cost she wasn't sure she could pay. She wanted to turn him away, to slam the door in his face, and scream that she didn't need saving, but the truth was that she didn't know how to survive alone, didn't know how to raise a child in a town that looked at her like she was a ghost of something best left forgotten, didn't know if love was enough to keep her afloat when the weight of everything she had lost threatened to pull her under. She hated herself for considering it, for looking at Henry and wondering if he could be the answer to the question that had haunted her since the moment Jonathan took his last breath. How do you go on living when the only life you ever wanted is gone? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest, because she knew that whatever choice she made in that moment would define the rest of her life, would decide whether she became a woman who survived or a woman who surrendered. And as Henry's voice broke through the silence, soft and full of something she wasn't ready to name, she closed her eyes and whispered Jonathan's name like a prayer, like a plea, like an apology, before taking a step forward into the unknown. Henry's breath was slow and measured, his presence steady in a way that made Evelyn's skin crawl, because it wasn't supposed to be this easy, wasn't supposed to feel like an invitation to something she wasn't ready to accept, and yet there he was, standing in the doorway of her grief, offering the kind of stability she had once thought she wanted before she had known what it meant to truly love. Before Jonathan had wrecked her world and rebuilt it in a way that made everything before him seem like a half-lived lie. She could see it in Henry's eyes, the way he looked at her like she was something that could still be saved, like she was a woman with a future rather than a relic of a love story that had been doomed before it had even begun. And for a moment, just one fleeting, selfish moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to take his hand, to let him pull her from the wreckage of her past and into something simpler, something safer, something that wouldn't make her wake up every morning wondering if today would be the day someone decided to punish her for the life she had chosen. But then she thought of Jonathan, of the way his hands had felt against her skin, the way his laughter had filled the empty spaces in her soul, the way he had looked at their daughter like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. And she knew, God, She knew that there was no moving on from him, no rewriting the past into something that made more sense, no escaping the consequences of a love that had burned so bright it had left nothing behind but ashes and unanswered questions. Henry sighed when she pulled away, his disappointment settling into the quiet like a storm waiting to break. But he didn't argue, didn't press her for an answer she wasn't ready to give, just nodded like he had known all along that this was how it would end, like he had been holding on to some small, foolish hope that she would choose him instead of the ghost of a man who would never walk through that door again. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the doorway of the house that no longer felt like a home, the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders like a sentence she didn't know how to serve. The days bled into nights, the baby growing in ways that made Jonathan's absence even sharper, her tiny hands grasping at empty air where he should have been, her laughter a reminder of all the moments he would never see. And Evelyn found herself drifting, caught between the past and a future she didn't know how to reach, caught between wanting to disappear and needing to hold on to something, anything, that still felt real. And then, one evening, as the sky bled gold and the town settled into the hush of twilight, there was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent, the kind that made her stomach twist with something close to dread, because she knew deep in her bones, that whatever was waiting for her on the other side would change everything. She opened it to find a man she didn't recognize, tall and wiry with eyes that held too many stories, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, each word sinking into her like a knife to the ribs. "I knew Jonathan," he said, and just like that, the world tilted, the air thick with something she couldn't name, something that felt too much like fate, and as he stepped inside, his expression unreadable, Evelyn braced herself for whatever truth had finally come to find her. Evelyn's breath hitched, her grip tightening on the doorframe as she studied the man before her, trying to place his face in the fragmented memories Jonathan had left behind, but nothing about him was familiar, not his sharp features, not the tired slump of his shoulders, not the deep, knowing way he looked at her, like he had been expecting this moment longer than she had been alive. Her daughter stirred in her crib behind her, a soft whimper breaking the silence, and the man's gaze flickered toward the sound before returning to her, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous, something that sent a chill crawling up her spine even as a part of her ached to know whatever truth he carried. "I knew Jonathan," he said again, slower this time, watching her face for the slightest crack, the slightest opening, and she swallowed hard, every part of her screaming to slam the door, to turn away, to pretend this moment had never happened, but she couldn't. Jonathan's ghost wouldn't let her, the weight of his secrets pressing against her chest like a leaden hand, demanding to be heard, demanding to be understood, demanding to be answered, and so she stepped aside, allowing the stranger into the house that had once been filled with laughter, with whispered promises, with a love that had defied the world and lost. The man didn't sit, didn't even take in the space around him. He only stared at her, waiting, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat as she forced herself to speak, to push past the fear curling in her stomach. "How did you know him?" she asked, and for a moment, he didn't answer, just let the question hang between them like something fragile, something waiting to break, before he finally exhaled and said, "He was my brother." The words hit her like a slap, the room tilting beneath her feet as a sharp, breathless shock overtook her, because Jonathan had never spoken of a brother, never hinted at family beyond the scars he carried from a childhood he rarely spoke of, a past he had buried beneath the weight of survival and secrecy, and yet here this man stood, the truth spilling from his lips like it had always been inevitable, like she should have known, should have seen the resemblance in the sharp cut of his jaw, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the way he stood as if he was always prepared to run or fight. She reached for the back of a chair, steadying herself as she whispered, "Jonathan he never mentioned you." And the man gave a small, bitter smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That doesn't surprise me," he said, his voice laced with something old and painful, something that made the air between them feel heavier than before. "He spent his whole life running from the past. From me. From everything we lost. Evelyn's mind raced, piecing together the parts of Jonathan she had known with the man standing before her, trying to understand, trying to grasp what this meant, what it changed, because if Jonathan had a brother, if he had family, then why had he spent his life alone? Why had he never gone back? Why had he never told her? Her fingers trembled as she gestured toward the table. "Sit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time, the man hesitated, his expression shifting into something uncertain, something almost wary. But then he nodded, pulling out a chair and lowering himself into it with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too many ghosts. Evelyn sat across from him, her hands curling into fists in her lap as she tried to ignore the way her heart pounded, the way her entire world felt like it was shifting beneath her. And when she finally found the courage to speak again, she asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you here?" The man exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before leaning forward, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "Because Jonathan wasn't who you thought he was," he said, his voice low, steady, like a confession long overdue. "And if you don't know the truth, then neither will she." His gaze flickered toward the crib, toward the tiny child sleeping there, oblivious to the weight of the past pressing down on the room, and Evelyn's breath caught because she understood what he was saying, understood the warning laced in his words, understood that the love she had fought so hard to protect had been built on a foundation of half-truths and buried sins, and for the first time since Jonathan's death, she felt something close to fear creeping beneath her skin, whispering that the man she had loved, the man she had risked everything for, had been keeping more than just his past from her. He had been keeping the truth itself. Evelyn's breath came shallow, her hands tightening around the fabric of her dress as the stranger's words settled over her like a cold fog creeping through the cracks of her ribs, twisting around her heart with a force she couldn't shake, wouldn't shake, because despite everything, despite the warning screaming in the back of her mind, she needed to know, needed to understand why Jonathan had never spoken of this man, why he had left an entire past buried beneath silence and fear, why the love they had fought so hard to keep had been built on the foundation of secrets she hadn't even known to question. And as she sat there, staring into the eyes of a man who carried the same sharp shadows as Jonathan, she finally found the courage to ask, "What do you mean? What truth?" Her voice barely above a whisper, her stomach twisting with the weight of 1,000 possibilities. But the man, Jonathan's brother, just studied her for a long moment, something dark and knowing flickering behind his gaze before he finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on the worn wooden table between them, his fingers steepling as he exhaled slow and steady like he was about to say something that had been trapped inside him for years, maybe decades, and then, finally, he spoke. "You think you knew Jonathan," he said, his voice calm but edged with something heavy, something old. "But you only knew the parts he wanted you to see. You knew the man who loved you, the man who became a father, but you didn't know the man who had to become someone else just to survive. You didn't know what he did before he found you." Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat tight, because she had always known there were things Jonathan kept from her, parts of his past he refused to share, but she had told herself it didn't matter, had convinced herself that love was enough, that the life they built was bigger than whatever had come before it. But now, staring into the face of the man who claimed to be his brother, she wasn't so sure anymore. "Tell me," she said, her voice stronger this time, firmer, because she needed to know even if it shattered everything, even if it left her standing in the wreckage of a love that had already been stolen from her. And for a long moment, Jonathan's brother just looked at her, searching her face, and then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like the weight of what he was about to say was too much to carry alone. "Jonathan killed a man," he said, the words landing between them like a match dropped into gasoline, and Evelyn flinched, her stomach twisting because she had known, she had suspected, had seen the darkness in his eyes sometimes, the way his jaw clenched too tightly when the past caught up to him, the way he never spoke of the years before they met, but hearing it now, spoken aloud, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "He told me," she said, her voice barely audible, "he told me it was self-defense." The man gave a small, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "That's what he wanted you to believe," he said. "That's what he told himself so he could sleep at night." Evelyn's hands trembled in her lap, her heart pounding as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then what really happened?" she asked, and this time, Jonathan's brother didn't hesitate. "The man he killed wasn't just anyone," he said. "He was the son of the most powerful man in the county. A white man. A man who thought he could do whatever he wanted to people like us." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the past clawing its way into the present, wrapping itself around Evelyn's throat as she tried to breathe, tried to understand, because she knew what that meant, knew what kind of war Jonathan must have been running from, knew that there had never been a future for them that wasn't stained with blood. "He was protecting someone," the man continued, his voice lower now, almost distant. "A girl, a woman I don't know. He never said her name. But I know she was in danger. I know that boy tried to take something that wasn't his. And I know Jonathan stopped him." Evelyn's pulse hammered, nausea curling in her stomach because she could see it, could picture the scene in her mind. Jonathan, younger, desperate, caught in a moment that would change everything, a moment where he had no choice but to fight, no choice but to kill, because if he hadn't, someone else would have suffered, and that wasn't something he could live with. Not the Jonathan she knew, not the man she loved. "He didn't run because he was guilty," his brother said, shaking his head. "He ran because it didn't matter, because the law wasn't made for men like him, because they would have hung him in the street and called it justice." Evelyn closed her eyes, her fingers pressing against her temples as the weight of it all settled over her, because she had always known their love was dangerous, had always known the world was waiting for a reason to tear them apart, but she had never realized just how much Jonathan had been willing to sacrifice just to have a chance at happiness, and now he was gone. And all she had left were the pieces of a story she didn't know how to put back together. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice hoarse, and Jonathan's brother hesitated, his jaw tightening before he finally answered. "Because they never stopped looking for him," he said. "Because they know about you, about the baby, and because the man he killed had a father who doesn't believe in letting debts go unpaid." The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows stretching longer, the walls pressing in as a new kind of fear settled in Evelyn's bones, the kind that came from knowing she wasn't just mourning Jonathan anymore. She was fighting to keep their child safe, fighting to survive a past that wasn't finished with them yet, fighting against a history that had already taken too much, and as the weight of it all crashed over her, she realized something else. Something even more terrifying. This wasn't the end of Jonathan's story. It was just the beginning of hers. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing, her body frozen in place as the full weight of Jonathan's past crashed over her like a wave she could never outrun. They knew about her, about the baby. And if what Jonathan's brother was saying was true, if the father of the man he had killed still had power, still had influence, still harbored vengeance, then she and her child were in danger in ways she had never imagined. She forced herself to steady her hands, to breathe, to think, but panic curled in her gut like a beast waiting to pounce. "What do I do?" she whispered, not knowing who she was asking, if she even wanted an answer, but Jonathan's brother didn't hesitate. "You leave," he said. "Tonight." His voice was low, urgent, but beneath it, she could hear something else, something almost like regret. "You run the way he did. You disappear before they come looking." Evelyn's fingers clenched against the worn fabric of her dress, her heart pounding in her throat because the thought of leaving, of vanishing into the night with nothing but a baby and the clothes on her back, was something she had never prepared for, had never even let herself consider, because Jonathan had always been the one to fight, to protect, to shield her from the worst of the world's cruelties. But Jonathan was gone, and now she was the only one left standing between their daughter and a world that wanted to erase them. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper as she forced herself to ask, "Where would I go?" Jonathan's brother exhaled, running a hand over his face, his expression dark with something close to sorrow. "There's a man in Chicago," he said. "Jonathan trusted him. If anyone can help you start over, it's him." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper and sliding it across the table. A name. An address. A life that wasn't hers, not yet, but might have to be. Evelyn stared at it, her hands trembling as she picked it up, the ink smudged from years of being folded and refolded, like Jonathan had held onto it for a day he hoped would never come. "And if I don't go?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Jonathan's brother didn't blink. "Then they'll find you," he said, "and they'll make you pay for what he did." A sharp, choking fear curled in her throat, but beneath it, buried deep where the grief hadn't yet rotted her completely, something else stirred: anger, determination, the same fire that had made her defy the world to love Jonathan in the first place. She thought of their daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware that the world outside these walls wanted to tear her apart before she even had a chance to live. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Couldn't. Jonathan had fought for them, had given everything for them. She wouldn't let it be for nothing. She looked up, meeting his brother's gaze, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Tell me everything," she said. "Everything Jonathan didn't." Jonathan's brother hesitated for only a moment before nodding, his shoulders sinking as if he had been waiting for this, as if the burden of carrying Jonathan's secrets alone had been crushing him for too long. And then, in a voice low and measured, he began to tell her a story. Of two brothers growing up in the South, of a father who broke them more than he raised them, of a world that never once belonged to them, but demanded their obedience anyway. Of the night everything changed, of a white man's son who thought he could take whatever he wanted, of a struggle in the dark, of a heartbeat too late and blood on Jonathan's hands. Of the days that followed, the terror, the knowing that the law would never be on their side, that the noose was waiting before the trial had even begun. "I told him to run," his brother said, his voice quieter now, rougher. "Told him to get as far away as he could. I was supposed to go with him, but he wouldn't let me. Said one of us had to stay, had to keep our mother safe. So he left. Changed his name. Built a new life." He looked down at the table, jaw tightening. "I never saw him again." Evelyn's chest ached, a deep, unbearable weight pressing against her ribs because she could see it, could see Jonathan younger, desperate, choosing exile over death, choosing survival over justice, choosing a life in hiding over the gallows. He had built a life with her, had given her love and a child and a home, but all this time, he had been living with the knowledge that one day, the past might come knocking. And now it had. "Did he regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's brother looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "He regretted leaving me," he said. "He regretted the price he had to pay. But you? The baby?" His voice softened, just barely. "You were the only thing in his life that wasn't a regret." A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. There was no time for grief. No time for mourning the man she had already lost. She had a child to protect. A life to save. Hers. Their daughter's. Jonathan's memory. She looked down at the slip of paper in her hand, at the address written in faded ink. Chicago. A city bigger than any she had ever known. A city where she could disappear. A city where maybe, just maybe, she could give their daughter a chance at the life Jonathan had fought so hard to give them. She swallowed hard and stood, her movements slow but certain. "I need time to pack," she said, already mentally sorting through what little she could bring. Jonathan's brother shook his head. "No time," he said. "Take the baby and go. Now!" Evelyn hesitated only for a second, staring at the home she had built, at the ghost of Jonathan in every corner, at the life they had shared, but then she turned, walking swiftly to the crib, scooping up the tiny bundle that smelled like innocence and safety and everything she was about to leave behind. She pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, whispering a silent promise then grabbed a small bag, stuffing it with diapers, a blanket, a single photo of Jonathan. When she turned back to Jonathan's brother, he was already at the door, glancing out the window into the night, his body tense. "They'll come soon," he murmured. "We need to get you to the station." Evelyn nodded, adjusting her grip on the baby, ignoring the way her heart pounded against her ribs, forcing herself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, to step through the doorway and into the unknown. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The door shut behind her with a quiet click, sealing the past inside. The night was dark, the air thick with something unspoken, and as she followed Jonathan's brother down the empty road toward an uncertain future, she knew only one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Evelyn clutched her daughter tightly as she followed Jonathan's brother through the dimly lit streets, every shadow stretching too long, every distant sound making her pulse jump. The weight of Jonathan's past pressed against her chest, suffocating, but she didn't have the luxury of breaking under it. The train station wasn't far, but every step felt like wading through quicksand, her body urging her to move faster even as dread gnawed at the edges of her mind. If they were watching, if they had already found her, no, she couldn't think like that. She had to focus. Had to get to Chicago. Had to disappear before the past swallowed her whole. The station was quiet at this hour, the platform nearly empty except for a few scattered travelers, their faces half hidden by the glow of flickering lamplight. Jonathan's brother handed her a ticket, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment, his touch rough with years of survival, of carrying burdens too heavy for one man alone. "This will get you as far as Louisville," he murmured, his voice low. "From there, switch trains. Pay in cash. Never take the same route twice." Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding as she adjusted the baby in her arms, the small bundle warm and fragile against her chest. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. "I'll buy you time." A lump formed in her throat. She knew what that meant. Knew that he was about to walk straight into the lion's den, that whatever price he was willing to pay, he would pay it without hesitation. Just like Jonathan. The realization made her stomach twist. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "I do," he said simply, his dark eyes holding hers for a long, heavy moment. "Jonathan didn't just love you. He died for you. Don't let it be for nothing." A whistle blew in the distance, the train's arrival shaking the platform beneath her feet. Evelyn inhaled sharply, the weight of this moment settling into her bones. She wanted to tell him to come with her, wanted to beg him not to do this, but she knew there was no stopping him. Just like there had been no stopping Jonathan. Some fights had to be fought, even if they were unwinnable. "Thank you," she whispered instead, and his lips barely twitched in something like a sad smile before he turned, disappearing into the night before she could say anything else. Evelyn forced herself to move, stepping onto the train with shaky legs, her breath shallow as she settled into a seat near the back. The baby stirred in her arms, tiny fingers curling against her blouse, and she pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head, whispering, "We're going to be okay." She wished she could believe it. The train lurched forward, the station sliding away behind her, and with it, everything she had ever known. The weight of her loss settled over her like a shroud, grief clawing at her throat, but she couldn't afford to drown in it. Not yet. Not ever. Jonathan was gone. His brother might be next. But she was still here. And so was their daughter. And as the train rumbled forward into the unknown, Evelyn made herself a promise. No matter what it took, no matter how far she had to run, she would make sure their child never had to live in fear. She would give her the life Jonathan had wanted for her. Even if it cost her everything. The past wasn't finished with her yet. But neither was she. Years passed like whispers in the wind, fleeting yet heavy with the weight of everything Evelyn had lost and everything she had fought to protect. Chicago had swallowed her whole in the beginning, its streets unfamiliar, its sounds too loud, its people moving too fast for a woman still grieving, still running, still looking over her shoulder with the fear that at any moment the past would catch up. But the past had a way of haunting even when it wasn't chasing, and in the quiet moments, when she tucked her daughter into bed, when she stared at her reflection in the window of the small apartment she had clawed her way into, when she lay awake at night listening for footsteps that never came, she felt Jonathan's absence like an open wound, never healing, never truly scarring over. She had taken on a new name, dyed her hair, learned to move through the city with her head down, with her steps measured, careful. She found work in a small diner, long hours on her feet, the pay barely enough, but it was honest, and more importantly, it was safe. For years, she lived like a ghost, moving through life as though she was waiting for something, waiting for the past to finally reach out and pull her back, waiting for Jonathan to walk through the door even though she knew he never would, waiting for the day when she could stop running and simply exist. And then, one winter evening, just as the first snowfall of the year dusted the streets in quiet white, the past found her. It came in the form of a man, tall, broad, with eyes that burned with something unspoken. She saw him before he saw her, standing across the street from the diner, half hidden in the shadows, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets. There was something familiar about him, something that made her breath hitch, something that sent a slow, cold dread creeping up her spine. He didn't move, just watched, waited, and Evelyn knew. She knew without him having to step closer, without him having to speak, without anything more than the way his presence alone set her heart racing. Her time had run out. She forced herself to finish wiping down the counter, forced herself to keep her steps measured as she grabbed her coat and told the manager she was heading home, forced herself to ignore the weight of his gaze as she stepped outside into the cold night air. The streets were empty, the city unusually silent beneath the snowfall, and yet she felt the world pressing in around her, suffocating, closing the distance between her and the past she had spent years trying to outrun. She turned a corner, her heart hammering, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and then, Evelyn! Her name, spoken like a memory, like a warning, like the final chapter of a story she had tried so desperately to leave unfinished. She turned slowly, and there he was, the man who had been watching, the man she had seen standing across the street, the man she had feared and longed for in equal measure. Jonathan's brother. He was older now, the years carved into the lines of his face, the grief sitting heavy in his dark eyes. But there was something else there too, something that made her throat tighten, her stomach churn. Regret. Guilt. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, even though she knew it was useless, even though she knew that whatever had brought him here wasn't something that could be ignored or wished away. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands still deep in his coat pockets. "They found me," he said, his voice low, rough. "And if they found me, it won't be long before they find you." The world tilted beneath her feet, her pulse roaring in her ears. No. No, she had been so careful. She had built a life, hidden in the cracks of this city, always watching, always waiting, and yet... "How?" she asked, the word barely escaping her lips. His jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter." A pause. A hesitation. And then, softer, almost broken. "I tried to lead them away. Tried to lose them. But they're coming, Evelyn." A tremor ran through her hands, through her bones. After all these years, after all the sacrifices, after all the nights spent lying awake, dreading this exact moment, it was happening. "What do I do?" she asked, the desperation creeping into her voice, the need for an answer, a way out, anything. Jonathan's brother stepped closer, his face shadowed beneath the dim streetlight, his presence heavy with something unsaid. "You run," he said. "One last time." But Evelyn knew. This was it. There was no more running, no more hiding, no more starting over. If she left now, if she picked up her daughter in the middle of the night and disappeared into another city, another name, another life, it would never end. It would always be this. The fear. The waiting. The running. She looked past him, down the empty street, past the ghosts of everything she had lost and everything she had fought for, and she made a choice. A slow, steady breath. A final goodbye to the life she had clung to. "No," she said, and for the first time in years, her voice didn't shake. "I'm done running." Jonathan's brother stared at her, something flickering behind his eyes. Respect, sadness, maybe even understanding. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Then we fight," he said. And as the snow fell in soft, silent sheets around them, Evelyn knew, whatever happened next, whatever price she had to pay, whatever ghosts came knocking, she would face them. For Jonathan. For their daughter. For the life they had built and the love they had shared. No more running. No more hiding. It was time to end this. One way or another. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.